Thank you very much. Three great talks, great ways of thinking, of putting ideas. I would like to start with our last speaker, Meneer van der Leeuw. I enjoyed very much also your own experience as a translator between hard sciences and the humanities. At the end, you said there are always alternatives. But during your talk, you mentioned the unexpected. And me as a scholar dealing with, from the humanities, but dealing mainly also with the arts, mainly with the intangible heritage, with the performing arts, the unexpected is always very central and very important. So our concept is not, and this is what I understood a bit from your points. Our position is not to combat or to eliminate the unexpected, but is to learn how to deal with it. I think this could be a way directed to the future. Maybe you can just make some remarks on
very
this.
happily, and you raise what I think is a very important point. Before I do that, though, I want to say one thing that I didn't really mention when this was being filmed, and that is that I am addressing with this talk basically the hard science community.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And it is relevant, clearly, to the social sciences. But I come out of a world where mostly the hard sciences have dominated for a long number of years. And I feel that that has fundamentally to change. Now to come to your real point, the unexpected. Look, I may have a very strange perspective, but if we look back about 4 centuries, science was in a totally different shape as where it is now. And very little methodology had been developed. But because of the foundation of the Royal Academy, which insisted that people demonstrate what they say or prove it, the function of science became focused on the relationship between the past and the present, because you couldn't demonstrate anything for the future. One underlying question that I have for all of us is if we were to very much more deliberately try and focus on the relationship between past, present, and future, we would indeed do, I think, ultimately, exactly what you're saying. We would try and find ways to integrate the unexpected into our current vision. And I think that is where I would be driving at if it was up to me.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, I just wanted to briefly say that I very much appreciate Mamphela's perspective from Africa. And having worked 25 years in Asia, I would like to say that Asia is now the economic hub of the world. And I think Asian perspectives are equally important and need to be heard. And there's a real need for leadership in the social sciences coming from within Asia. And I must say that having taught at an Australian university, we have a lot of students in doing MBAs, business studies, economics and so on, but very few in the social sciences, very few. It doesn't seem to be a very great interest, and I'd really would like to encourage any listeners in Asia to come forward and to encourage more thinking in the social sciences from that Asian perspective. And I saw we have Fatwa El Gundi on the chat, and I would like to invite her to comment on the North African perspective from the Arab world, if that's technically possible.
North African perspective on, let me give you an
sustainability.
Example on sustainability. Let me share with you something that I think is very informative for all of us and adds knowledge. I was invited by Qatar University to go to Qatar and build the social sciences in 2006. I stayed there for a decade. And that was part of an initiative that was started by the university under the enlightened woman president, Dr. Sheikh Al-Masnad, which is to introduce sustainability in education. And I was invited as a social science person to come in and build the social science within the sustainability program. So that's the background. I think we can learn from what happens in real life situations. It was a big challenge, but I would say it failed. The project failed. And I think we can learn as scientists and developers and politicians from failures in the real world. You ask yourself why it failed. We introduced changes, we introduced ideas from the West, we introduced technology. They already had technology, but we introduced it in the, through the social sciences, and we modernized education in the Qatar National University. But the students, the parents, the teachers were very unhappy, and it all came to a head, and they protested to the point where the Emir of Qatar came to the university to discuss it with them, what's wrong, why they didn't like the reform that is being introduced, which is coming from the West, wholesale imported from the West to modernize the system. Well, after listening to them, he asked the university to cut the reform project in 24 hours and to go back to the original system. And that was dramatic. That was shocking. It was dramatic. A lot of money went into that, a lot of expertise, a lot of talent from the West, a lot of ideas, a lot of models, and all this came crashing down. And in 24 hours, we had to go back to where it was. In my own case, I tried to salvage the situation of my experience by breaking the process of intended sustainability to smaller units. And I focused on the smaller units. I can't, in this context, go into detail. And I focused on these smaller units, and they succeeded. And I would say I did introduce small unit sustainability, University of Qatar, by focusing on these smaller and leaving out the general reform project. So I left disappointed that all our work went down, and the president of the university was removed. They changed to a system. If you look at what we learned from that, it was said, it was presented earlier. Many comments alluded to that. Context. The importing a system from the West wholesale was a big shock for the faculty, for the students, for the parents. The parents were very unhappy at what was happening. They said, what was wrong with our culture? What is wrong with our civilizational culture in the Arab world? We have academies in the Middle Ages. We introduced Arab science. We introduced all of that. Why should we necessarily get the social science of the West? That's one context. The other thing is that sustainability projects should take in consideration population size. This is a case where a minority are Qataris and a majority are migrant workers from the outside. that develops a very complex situation in the society there, and we have to take this in consideration. Whom are we talking to? This is a society with a minority natives, citizens, and a majority from the outside Asia, Africa, Arabs, and so on. Also, so it is not only the population size, but the population character. All these social categories there. The social inequalities that exist in Qatar are different from the social inequalities that exist in the United States. This context has to be taken in consideration when you build a sustainability model. And so that's my assessment, that this is why it failed.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Can I just intervene here, please?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Because I want to correct the impression that what I was presenting was only applicable to Africa. It's not. What I was critiquing is the assumption that the Euro-American definition of universality, which has been dominant in our social sciences, in our physical and other sciences, is something we need to shift. And what has just been said about Qatar is also an interesting example, that I talk about Africa and you decide to separate Africa between North and South. Why? Because you never talk about, I mean, it's always very interesting, this desire to separate Sub-Saharan Africa from North Africa. And that's part of the problem of the mentality we bring to the social sciences, which is very much influenced by the mechanistic fragmentation, separation, command and control, which is part of the industrial mentality. And so, for example, Gary was talking very eloquently about what FDR did in the face of the Depression. But what FDR did was fantastic for America, but not fantastic for the rest of the world, because he was completely the blind spots about the slavery in America at that time continued, despite all of that boldness and the bigness. And so I think if we as social scientists and humanities want to shift the paradigm away from this unsustainable pathway we are on, we need to shift from the assumption of universality when it comes to Euro-American issues or thought processes, that we simply apply them across. What I described about the relatedness, the importance of pluriversality and the relational aspect of being human applies to Asia, to all areas where indigenous knowledge is still valued as an important starting point. And so I think what we really need to do as social scientists and humanities is not to simply broaden what we have, but is to question the very paradigm of our own approaches to what it is we want to learn, how we learn it, and how we learn from the mistakes of the past.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a wonderful position. I think this is the core of what we try to achieve, is to shift from a natural focused, natural scientific focused approach to a broader approach of the cultural dimension, because all form of natures, first of all, have also a cultural interpretation. The way we see nature is already expression of our cultural schemes of interpretation. Therefore, it needs to be in the forefront of the sustainability issues in policy and in research. So maybe I would like to ask Gary if you could comment on the last proposition that have been made by Fatwa and Dr. Ampeli and Sander. Gary, we can't hear you. Can you put the microphone on, Gary?
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I've enjoyed both the other presentations very much and can resonate with so many of the points that the other speakers have made. In giving the example of FDR, I was only really trying to illustrate one point, which is so often forgotten in economics. The example was to illustrate the importance of the subjective dimensions, which are not in the textbooks at all, and were not being applied in the economic theory. And I was really trying to address the issue, which Saunders has also raised in another way, about the tendency of the social sciences to become mechanistic and reductionistic because of the success of the natural sciences beforehand. And I was also trying to illustrate by mentioning the importance of the individual. And it's amazing how even in the social sciences, how often we neglect that extraordinary characteristic of the human sciences is that we don't just follow laws of similar behavior. We also have that capacity for uniqueness. And I mentioned very briefly in my presentation about the Green Revolution in India and attributed to the thinking of one person who happened to have been a minister in the government and a farmer. And he said, if we take the latest technology in the world in hybrid varieties, we can double the food grain production of the country in 10 years, which essentially means that we can do in 10 years what the society has done over 10,000 years of civilization. And when he proposed it, it was laughed at. It was laughed at even by the members of his own party in the parliament. And his faith was not in the technology at all. His faith was in the farmers. And the success of the Green Revolution was not due primarily to the technology, which has been shown elsewhere. It was due to the fact that he understood the process of social change and of motivating tens of millions of, at that time, not now, but that time, uneducated farmers to radically and dramatically change their behavior. And he said, essentially, we have to provide them with the incentives and the social organization which they lack to encourage them to behave and conduct differently. And I think there's been so much of emphasis on either the laws of economics or on the public policies that we've very largely forgotten the subjective dimension, which both Mandela and Saunders, in different words, were mentioning. When we're dealing with the human being, we have to ask ourselves, first of all, under what circumstances will people be motivated to change their understanding, to change their values, to change their awareness, to release their energy, to change their behavior? And how can we support and facilitate that process? And this comes to sustainability as well. That's why I started by mentioning in my opening remarks about the crises we face today. The crises we face today are being reduced to degrees of temperature and similar variables, but they really get reduced to human values. And our concept, I loved what Saunders said about the silo effect and everything, and the point that he made, that there's no unity in the social sciences. We seem to be, not just across countries, but even across disciplines, we're talking about different species. The assumptions, the psychological assumptions of the economist about what motivates human behavior are very different than the psychological assumptions of the psychologist or the anthropologist. In the natural sciences, we have a fundamental conception that builds on itself. We're working with different species almost in different disciplines, not just because we're in different countries. Before we started the meeting, Mandela mentioned to me about the notion of survival of the fittest and the application of that to human systems. And yet, for 150 years, it was the dominant thinking. It's still the dominant thinking in some areas. It never accurately described the way human beings in social systems work. The competition was always there, but it was always secondary and sub to the fact that civilization has been based on human relationships, positive, mutually beneficial human relationships. We wouldn't even have language or trade or commerce or any of the other things that have, or cities, if it hadn't been for that. And yet we've become so wedded to notions that are completely divorced from reality. And I mentioned a second one, which we lived with for 50 years and is only now being discredited. Friedman's idea that the role of corporations is only to maximize shareholder value. It was never that. And yet we live with superstitions and fixed conceptions, and they dominate the way our society works because we've taken the human value out of it. We've taken the importance of the human values, the cultural values, the plural versatility that Mamfella talked about, and depreciated it. We've dehumanized ourselves in much of what goes for the social sciences today, and I think we have to bring back that.
Okay, thank you very much, Gary. I think this is a clear statement emphasizing the need for transdisciplinary research, because if the discipline among themselves don't agree on a common position, then the more it's important to deal with the people directly in the field that will be the real actors of change. So they will make also a decision what will be taken on from the scientific standpoint and what will be implemented. So I think that's a wonderful outcome of this short session. I would like to give now the word to Annes Nick from the Club of Rome Charter Europe. She will be the chair of the next session and maybe make a little comment about all this what has been said in respect of teaching and education, how we can implement that in teaching program, leading then to the next session of tomorrow, but maybe make a little bridge to the educational side in 90 seconds.
I'd really like to thank Mampili for a wonderful, inspiring contribution, and it is indeed what I try to do here. I'm based in a European, very Western, very high-ranked university. I take my students through a process of unlearning this concept of development and opening to biomimicry and indigenous wisdom. And they tell me it changes their lives, but of course the whole system around them does not reward them for that kind of knowledge. And I would like to bring that back to what Sanders van der Leeuwen said about, I think based on Luhmann, that our society, the Western society, does not communicate with the environment, as opposed to, I think, Abiyala and Ubuntu, where Mother Nature and Pachamama is communicated with, but we don't. We talk about it. It means we talk implicitly with it. We treat it as a partner around the table, call it externality. And I think that means that the information that we use about this environment does not just have blind spots, but it is actively distorted because we use a money system that drives us towards extracting financial value, as Gary said, from nature or from human interactions. So for me, education for the 21st century is certainly based on systems thinking. It's based on unlearning these notions of human progress equals natural exploitation or exploitation of other nations. And it also implies relearning that money basically is an agreement among people in a community to use something as a means of exchange or a store of value, and that we need to take that power back again from banks and governments who gave it to private banks that do not have long-term, ecological or societal goals. They have private profit goals. So I think students need to learn how this communication through money is actively distorting not only our relationship among each other, but also our relationship with nature that we do talk, maybe not with, but about, and that we use, and that it threatens our survival. And I think the most important, the question that I'm sometimes struggling with, I get a lot of students from Africa and from Asia, and they come to Europe hoping for a better education and a better future. And then here I am telling them, don't believe what this university is telling you. So I'm often struggling with that dilemma. They come to us hoping to, I guess, to get share of our wealth and our development and our progress, while at the same time we're at a tipping point where we're saying, no, we want to learn from you. You hopefully still have that indigenous knowledge and wisdom. So that is, I think, a dilemma that we have now in education that hopefully we can discuss a bit further in the...
Thank you very much, Anne. We have a question. Thank you very much, Anne. We have a question out of the chat from Hermine Baer, who is asking to comment on the claim that the individual can bring change. I can make that a short comment, but this is, of course, a question that will remain throughout the conference. I think that it's very complicated, but we have good insight in that, the role, how individuals or subjects of action are interlinked with social structures. But some social scientists are saying that what people are doing is just the outcome of social structures, but we have to think that all social structures have been implemented, built up by individual action over time. So all these structures are changeable. So therefore, I would say the initiative of the individuals is very, very important, but I'm also convinced that individuals cannot succeed if they don't have the necessary social and cultural conditions to bring their ideas through and to bring change about. So that's why we need both sides of the coin, the social and cultural constellation on the one side, and the space for individual action of innovation and change. I leave it with that for the moment. I mean, we need to close the session.
May I say something, Benno?
Yes, Carlos, please, but very short. We need to change for technical reasons.
A short comment, because I wanted to emphasize the central role of epistemological shift, which was very explicitly present in the presentation by Mampela, and which is about transdisciplinarity. We talk about transdisciplinarity and mobilizing all disciplines. This goes much beyond just having the disciplines with their current conceptual frameworks all around the table in equality of conditions. This goes to the point that Ilya Prigozhin made when he said reality is richer than any language. And this goes to the point that we are not able to frame a reality in our languages. There is always something beyond that, while the purpose and the mission, in a sense, of natural sciences has been to understand reality as much as we could, and from that, the temptation of controlling reality is there. The shift we are talking about is forgetting about that. We cannot control emergence.
Thank you very much, Carlos.
I think we will talk more about that later.
Exactly. Thank you much for that input. We continue on that certainly over the next sessions. We have to close this session now for technical reasons. The next session will be chaired by Anne Snick, as I already said, and I hope to welcome you back. You now on the Zoom, especially also for the last session on a Thursday afternoon, how to implement all the results of the discussion we have in practical manner. And but now we have to close and hope to see you back in 10 minutes' time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.